Whether you agree with it or not, if you want to understand the current United States political administration's driving force of white Christian nationalism, this video is for you. What is white Christian nationalism, you ask? Let's talk about the flag and the cross. Check this out. This is TenOnReligion. Hey peeps, it's Dr. B with TenOnReligion. If you like religion and philosophy content, one thing I really need you to do is to smash that sub button because it really helps out the channel. Also, if you find this content interesting, drop me a super thanks here on YouTube. The transcript is available at TenOnReligion.com and new episodes are on the way, so drop me some views. Sociologists Philip Gorski at Yale University and Samuel Perry at the University of Oklahoma wrote a book titled The Flag and the Cross, published in 2022, which was during President Biden's presidency. This means it was after Trump's first term, but before his second term. Now, for those of you who don't know, sociology is the scientific study of group behavior. These authors use and cite a number of surveys which were administered to thousands of Americans. So this book isn't as much about their opinions, but rather what Americans say about themselves. This book has 5 parts, and they're all important. So I'm going to give you a synopsis of each of them. First, there's an introduction, and then they address 4 questions. 1, what is white Christian nationalism? 2, when did it emerge? 3, how does it work politically? And 4, where might it be headed? Now, the last question might be the most interesting because, again, this book was written before the authors even knew Trump would ever be elected again. And their understanding of the situation was a bit prophetic. But first, the introduction. Let's get started. For most conservative white Christians, white Christian nationalism is invisible because it's the water they swim in and the air they breathe. Before the January 6th Capitol insurrection, it was also invisible to most secular progressives because they live in a bubble of their own, in which this seems fringe rather than mainstream. So the January 6th event was like an eruption of a volcano. The deep story is this: America was founded as a Christian nation by white men, traditional Christians, who based the founding on Christian principles. But this story is a myth. The religious views of the founders ranged wildly, and the Declaration and the Constitution drew on various influences. The goal of white Christian nationalism is to forever redeem and restore a lost world, corrupted by outsiders, and that won't happen without a fight. As white Christians approach minority status, white Christian nationalists have started to turn against American democracy. So long as white Christians were in the majority and could call the shots, they were willing to tolerate a certain amount of pluralism, provided that minorities did not insist on too much equality. And now they view the efforts to expand access to the democratic process as an existential threat to their political power. Remember that in the 2016 Republican primaries, a majority of white conservative Christians chose Trump over numerous GOP candidates with far stronger evangelical religious faith. Why? Because they wanted a fighter for Christians, read people like us, not someone who fights like a Christian. It's important to understand the difference. And now on to the first question. What is white Christian nationalism? It's white because it seeks unity around power for whites. It's nationalism because it rejects pluralism. And the Christian part, well, they're not exactly Jesus followers because it's more of a political movement. The authors identified 7 different indicators of Christian nationalism based on Americans' survey responses and their level of agreement with the following statements. The first 2 statements imply that God has a special relationship with the United States. 1. I consider founding documents like the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution to be divinely inspired. 2. The success of the United States is part of God's plan. The remaining 5 statements ask Americans to affirm what they think the government should do, reflecting their political theology. 3. The federal government should declare the United States a Christian nation. 4. The federal government should advocate Christian values. 5. The federal government should enforce a strict separation of church and state. This is based on how much they disagree with this statement. 6. The federal government should allow the display of religious symbols in public spaces. 7. The federal government should allow prayer in public schools. Now, before the civil rights movement, white politicians who wanted to stir up their voters could just use racial slurs. After the civil rights movement, they had to find more subtle ways of invoking race, like illegals or terrorists. These are dog whistles which can be used to signal us as well as them. For example, Christian values now simply implies conservative white values. But the main concern with these statements is their mythic quality. Historically, the United States was not founded by Pilgrims and Puritans. 98% of America's inhabitants were not evangelicals at the founding. It has never been illegal to pray in public schools, and the Constitution says absolutely nothing about God, the Bible, or the Ten Commandments. And the weird thing about this survey data was that Christian nationalists have an incorrect understanding of American history, but only if they are white. Black or Hispanic Americans had more historically correct views of the founding of the country. Here's another 5-question test the authors administered, in which the higher the respondents score on Christian nationalism, the lower they score on the following questions because they give the wrong answers. 1. The First Amendment says Congress can't restrict religious liberty, but Congress could make laws privileging Christianity. This is false. 2. The U.S. Constitution references our country's obligations to God several times. This is also false. 3. The phrase, "In God We Trust," did not become the nation's official motto until after 1950. This is true. The phrase, "Under God," was not added to the Pledge of Allegiance until after 1950. This is true. 5. Supreme Court decisions in the 1960s made it illegal for students to pray or read their Bibles in public schools. This is false. Why are they so misinformed? In part because there's a cottage industry that spreads historical misinformation. Not only may they have learned erroneous religious history, but the ideology of white Christian nationalism may incline white Americans to reinterpret their history in ways that elevate their own group as heroes and victims. White Christian nationalism unites all these elements. Its components are scapegoating of minorities, distrust in science, the media, and establishment politicians, corresponding trust in strongman leaders, and conspiratorial thinking. It's about ethno-traditionalism and protecting the freedom of a very narrowly defined us. Let's get into the second question of when did white Christian nationalism emerge? The authors identified several crucial moments in history. The Puritans, in the mid to late 1600s, understood themselves as a new Israel and came to see New England as their promised land. Like the Israelites conquering Canaan, they were conquering the New World. In their view, to be Christian was to live like an English person. Killing or converting native Indians was the norm rather than coexistence because they were viewed as animals or even devil worshippers. Eventually, a racial order emerged in which white meant free, black meant slave, and red meant neither bound nor free but savage. The shift to a system of black slavery was economic, but it created a problem for English theologians as some blacks converted to Christianity. On what grounds could Christians enslave other Christians? What was needed, in a phrase, was a racist theology. Two options developed. One, pre-Adamism, the belief that there had been two separate creations, resulting in two separate species, pre-Adamites and Adamites. Only the latter were humans with souls. This option was not as popular as the second option of Noah's curse. Because Ham had seen Noah drunk and naked in his tent, God placed a mark on Ham's son Canaan and condemned his offspring to perpetual servitude. And Ham must have been black. By 1700, pro-slavery theologians said black skin is the result of God's curse and slavery is good for them because they were exposed to Christianity and white civilization. Even though some theologians argue that all men are made in the image of God, the curse of Ham argument won because theology follows the money. In this new world, the colonists felt British during their struggle against the Catholic French and their native allies during the French and Indian Wars in the mid-1700s, but then the colonists felt American after the Revolutionary War in the later 1700s and the War of 1812. White freedom was based on controlling land and other resources, and black slavery was the main form of wealth required to maintain that freedom. Black slavery, especially in the southern colonies, was the bedrock foundation of white freedom. By the end of the War of 1812, white Christian nationalism had become both Protestant and American. Jump ahead to the late 1800s, and the American Empire began as an attempt to end the Spanish Empire. You see, when America employs violence, it does so to spread freedom to others. Military violence would be used to spread the blessings of freedom throughout the world. By 1989, most white evangelicals had become conservative Republicans, and also pro-market and pro-military. The rightward turn of white evangelicals actually began with a Supreme Court decision, Brown versus Board of Education. Opposition to racial integration was the real catalyst for the rise of the religious right. In American religious history, there was a reversion to a premillennialist version of the end time story in the Bible. By the middle of the 2000s, one of the strongest predictors that white Americans affirm Christian nationalist ideology is their confidence that literal rapture and Armageddon events will take place. And now on to the third question: how does it work politically? Wealthy economic elites and conservative religious leaders sowed their seeds in a rich soil fertilized by 3 centuries of white Christian nationalism. The Tea Party movement starting in 2009, the MAGA movement starting in 2015, and the Capitol insurrection on January 6, 2021 all sprouted from this same soil. Christian libertarianism joined free markets, racial purity, and authoritarian religion into a unified biblical worldview. Yet, when it comes to measures of personal religiosity, like church attendance, Tea Partiers score far lower than self-identified members of the religious right. In other words, the myth of a Christian nation was far more important to them than actually being Christians. Christian instead functions as a cultural identity marker, one that separates us from them. The Tea Party was fueled by a blend of big money and popular energy. But ethnic and racial anxieties were the spark plugs that really ignited it. Now, this is going to hurt a little bit, and I'm going to try to be careful here. The very thought of a black man in the White House was deeply disturbing to many white Americans. The right-wing radio personality Rush Limbaugh actually composed and performed a song called Barack the Magic Negro, his literal words, sung to the tune of Puff the Magic Dragon. Bruh. In 2020, Trump presented him with the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Opinion polls showed a strong correlation between support for the Tea Party and opposition to immigration. In November 2020, roughly 70% of white evangelicals the authors surveyed believed the U.S. Constitution is divinely inspired. Nearly 80% affirmed constitutional originalism, and over 3/4 reject the idea that the Constitution should be regularly amended to account for cultural changes. And Trump, naturally a person would want to ask, how could conservative evangelicals who claim to defend family values, character, and civility support a thrice-married, egomaniacal real estate mogul who paid off porn stars? The answer is complicated.
Wait a minute!
Similar to premillennialists' view of a final battle between good and evil, Trump sees life as an endless battle between us and them. We should not be surprised that Trump's rhetoric resonated so strongly with many white devotees of Christian nationalism. The MAGA narrative is not only a secularized white Christian nationalism, it is a reactionary version. Given the importance of blood sacrifice in many versions of Christian theology and the mystical powers often attributed to it, Trump's blood rhetoric probably resonated with many. such as Muslim terrorists executed with bullets dipped in pig's blood. We need the Muslim ban and the border wall so that the national body cannot be penetrated or polluted by non-white or non-Christian bodies. Notice the need to protect the pure blood of the national body from pollution or infection. MAGA was white Christian nationalism without the biblical references, but with the same deep story. So why does Trump's ethos still resonate with so many white Christians? Because religious freedom does not mean favoring government neutrality on the issue of religion, but rather elevating and institutionalizing white Christianity's influence in the public square. Their idea of freedom means freedom for us. But what about them? What about the others? This is where violence comes in. Trump himself does not employ physical violence. He is a master of verbal violence, though he is not above threatening or inciting physical violence. Confronted with protesters on the campaign trail, he urged his supporters to punch them in the face or knock the crap out of them. Don't be nice about it, he added. I'll pay for your lawyer. We need to understand the vital connection between white Christian nationalism and authoritarian control over outsiders. Freedom for us, violence and order for them. Conservative whites fear and abhor violence in some contexts, for example from blacks, immigrants, or Muslims, but they applaud it in other contexts, for instance by police, soldiers, and other good guys with guns. Freedom for whites and authoritarian control over non-whites. No two contemporary situations demonstrates this us versus them dynamic of liberty and righteous violence than Americans' current understanding of 1. The worthiness to participate in democracy, and 2. The Capitol insurrection. Just months before the 1980 election between Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan, Paul Weyrich, co-founder of the American Legislative Exchange Council and the Moral Majority, spoke at a Dallas conference. Here before his Christian right audience, Weyrich explained the strategy. Our group stays in power if fewer people, especially our opponents, are able to vote. The policy implication is clear: make it harder for problem populations to vote. Weyrich's anti-democratic sentiment has been repeated on the Christian right for decades since. Christian nationalism is the strongest predictor that white Americans believe we already make it too easy to vote in this country. By contrast, as white Americans' affirmation of the author's Christian nationalism indicators increases, their likelihood of believing voter suppression in presidential election is a real problem plummets. Why? Because white Christian nationalism is fundamentally anti-democratic for others, that is, those who are unworthy of participation. In February 2021, roughly 1 month after the insurrection, the author surveyed Americans about the events of January 6. Unsurprisingly, the more that white Americans affirmed white Christian nationalist ideology, the more likely they were denied Trump had anything to do with the event. Also, the more likely they are to say that they stand with the rioters, and the less likely they are to say that rioters should all be caught and prosecuted. And that takes us up to the end of Trump's first term in office. The authors then ask, where might it be headed? And the authors had a lot to say about this. Since we now know Trump was elected a second time, how correct were they? Let's see what they said. The title of this chapter, incidentally, is Avoiding the Big One. Remember, they're writing this in 2022. The January 6th insurrection was an eruption of subterranean forces that have been building for some time. Those forces have not disappeared. On the contrary, they are building again. A second eruption would likely be larger and more violent than the first, large enough to bury American democracy for at least a generation. The United States has slowly become less white, less Christian and less powerful, more diverse, secular, and cosmopolitan. And this collided with a certain conception of America as a white Christian nation favored by God and ruled by white Christian men ready to defend freedom and order with violence. Where is white Christian nationalism going? What might happen in a worst-case scenario? And what can Americans do to prevent that from happening? White Christian nationalism is not conservative. in the sense that it's not trying to preserve the status quo. It is reactionary. It seeks to destroy the status quo and return to a mythical past. The only kind of change that reactionary movements are averse to is change that threatens their power. Trump's 2016 campaign manager and his closest presidential advisors, Steve Bannon and Stephen Miller, both embraced the Great Replacement conspiracy theory, the belief that left-wing elites were intentionally promoting non-white and non-Christian immigration with the goal of replacing white Christian voters and consolidating their power. America's demographics are changing, but rather than be more inclusive to mobilize its base, they appeal to nativism. There was a shift in the boundaries of Christianity. Before, to be a Christian was to be a member of a church and or to affirm certain beliefs. But now calling oneself a Christian or even an evangelical is sometimes just a way of claiming membership in an ideological or political tribe or defending a certain way of life. This was even George W. Bush's argument against Muslim terrorists. Religious terms like Christian and evangelical are becoming markers of social identity and political views rather than just religious conviction. Evangelical leaders such as Billy Graham blurred the lines between American imperialism and American Christianity with their language of missions and crusades. As an aside, what does a Muslim hear when a Christian says the word crusade? For those of you that have studied European history, you know the answer: not good things. The new enemy is internal, globalists, as opposed to the real Americans who are nationalists. Remember, Trump self-identified as a nationalist at a rally back in 2018. Right-wing theologians say that God divided humanity into nations. Jerusalem had walls. Heaven will have walls. And so border walls are God's idea. Christians must obey and enforce the laws, especially immigration laws. God wants you to stay in the nation where He put you. Religious conservatives loved Trump, not only because they trusted him, but because they saw him as a savior and protector who would defend them from their enemies, particularly from the perceived threat of being marginalized and persecuted. They believed he would rescue whites and Christians from extreme victimization. Trump once described himself as the chosen one. A few even call him the anointed one, a biblical term once reserved for the Israelite kings. In 2022, someone even wrote a book which was distributed at some of Trump's rallies with the title of President Donald J. Trump, the Son of Man, the Christ. When the award-winning journalist Jack Jenkins from the religious news service saw this on social media, he said, I have some theological questions. But anyway, on to democracy. By democracy, the authors mean what political philosophers call liberal democracy. Democracy simply means rule by the people. Liberal democracy has a number of additional features. These include universal voting rights, human rights, and equality under the law, among others. White Christian nationalism threatens American liberal democracy because it defines the people in a way that excludes many Americans. This is ethno-nationalism, which defines national belonging in terms of race, religion, and native birth. Trump supporters often spoke of themselves as we, the people, as if their political opponents were not and could not become real Americans. This is one reason why so many were quick to embrace Trump's big lie about the stolen election. If the real people had voted, then wouldn't Trump have won? If he lost, then there has to have been fraud. Because it reinforces a narrow ethno-nationalism definition of the people, white Christian nationalism primes its followers to demand election integrity reforms that restrict ballot access for their opponents, especially when they lose. According to the Brenner Center for Justice, as of late spring 2021, nearly 400 voter suppression laws have been introduced, and not since the Jim Crow era has voter suppression been undertaken so openly. There is also cancel culture. The state of Texas passed legislation canceling Martin Luther King Jr. by voting to remove his I Have a Dream speech from its civics curriculum. Like, seriously. So long as natural-born white Christians were the dominant group, numerically and culturally, they did not need to directly challenge America's democratic institutions. Confronted with minority status and diminishing power, some are now prepared to reject liberal democracy in favor of stronger measures. Two prominent conservatives, one a former Trump official, even mused on air about lessons learned from the Capitol insurrection and the possible advantages of an American monarchy. The leaders of nationalist regimes all come into power via democratic elections. Once in power, however, they instituted changes that made it difficult, often very difficult, to remove them from office again. American institutions already provide several mechanisms that a minority party can exploit to retain power, such as the Electoral College and gerrymandering. As a result, the number of seats that the GOP controls at the state and federal levels is often highly disproportionate to their share of the popular vote. Thus, Christian nationalism is powerfully associated with whites being unwilling to address gerrymandering or support electing the president by popular vote. Outside the United States, authoritarian populist leaders rarely do away with elections entirely, but they often change election rules to their advantage, such as who can vote, how they're counted, or how electoral districts are drawn. Having changed the rules, autocrats then change the umpires, the courts, by appointing loyalist judges, populist strongmen, prevent legal challenges to new election laws, and to other reforms that favored them and their allies. Having reformed the electoral and judicial systems, they then focus their attention on the legislatures, or rather on transferring as many of their powers as possible to the chief executive, which is to say, themselves. Sometimes states of emergency were declared, sometimes executive decrees were released, but everywhere power was centralized. Corruption took root as a strategy of political control. Those who refused to play the game and tried to build up rival networks were harassed, expropriated, or even exterminated. Sometimes the violence was carried out by law enforcement, intelligence officials, or the uniformed military. At other times it was carried out by vigilante groups and paramilitary organizations who shared the regime's ideology. The targets of these attacks were not just political or economic rivals. Strongman regimes also seek to control culture. Thus, journalists, academics, and religious leaders were often subject to intimidation, imprisonment, or execution. The harshest violence is often reserved for internal enemies of the regime, however defined. The authors state that the Capitol insurrection may well prove to have been a test run for 2024. Make no mistake, this will not happen again. A Trumpist victory that would end democracy is a real possibility. What could prevent this? Political, economic, cultural, religious, and military power in the form of police forces is decentralized in America and thus hard to manipulate. Multiracial and multicultural corps of military and law enforcement offices are much less likely to support the kind of avowedly or tacitly racist and Christianist regime that Trump and his white Christian nationalist supporters dream about. The more probable outcome is that the exercise of power and suffrage is restricted. The harshest treatment would likely be reserved for non-white, undocumented immigrants, who might be subjected to mass deportations on an unprecedented scale. See what I mean when I said these authors were prophetic? They continued on. If the MAGA regime endured for 2 decades or more, and most authoritarian regimes do, existing trends towards self-sorting along ideological lines would likely continue or even accelerate. At this point in the process, secession scenarios and even civil war could start to become possibilities. Trumpist America would not be Hitler's Germany, but it would be characterized by governmental incompetence accompanied by gradual economic decline. Ironically, a serious attempt to make America great again would probably end up making it chaotic and poor. The authors finished the book by stating that America is an experiment. It is an attempt to build a nation of nations and a people of peoples, and also to build a representative democracy on a continental scale. The challenge is twofold: to maintain social solidarity amid deep diversity, and to sustain civic engagement in a mass democracy. Neither is easy. Donald Trump and his most zealous followers have already made their decision. They have rejected America's experiment in multiracial democracy in favor of white Christian nationalism. Whether they are successful is up to the rest of us. This book was actually quite short with only 130 pages of text, but this is a lot to take in and digest because it explains so much. I didn't show you all of the bars and graphs and data they presented, so if you want to see that, buy the book or grab a copy at your local library and read it for yourself. But what did you think about their explanation of white Christian nationalism? Leave a comment below and let me know what you think. And again, if this was in any way helpful, drop me a super thanks. Until next time, stay curious. If you enjoyed this, support the channel. In the link below, please like and share this video and subscribe to this channel. This is TenOnReligion.